Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today's video, running back rankings for the Fantasy Football Championship, the last week of the fantasy season. But if you guys are still watching, if you've still got a team that's looking to win a title, don't forget this channel, the content from this channel is still going to keep coming into the NFL playoffs as well, so stick around after that. But we'll get to the top 30 running backs on the week. Anything you need to do in terms of start, sit at the running back position, we will cover today. And of course, if you guys haven't checked out our friends over at Betfred, they have a brand new offer for you. If you sign up, bet $50, you're going to get $111 in free bets. And then as well, for the next 5 weeks after you sign up, you're going to get up to $1,000 in free bets as well from Betfred. So go sign up. That link is down below in the description. And for those of you in Ohio, less than a week now, January 1st, sports betting is live in the state of Ohio. I'll give you the pre-register link as well down in the description if you want to sign up. They'll also give you an extra $40 if you pre-register too at Betfred before things go live. But let's get to the top 30 backs on the week, starting with Mr. Christian McCaffrey at number 1. No surprise here. San Francisco's offense is just in a groove right now, and Christian McCaffrey is a big reason for that. Las Vegas, 23rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs and 20th in rush DVOA. As always, expect this 49ers offense to continue to find success on the ground predominantly. And for as long as McCaffrey is that number 1 back without really a true guy in terms of, between Jordan Mason, Tyrion Davis-Price aren't really succeeding him that much, as long as Elijah Mitchell's out. He's a huge play for you. At 2, Saquon Barkley. Love the matchup this week against the Colts. One where I think the Giants could find themselves in a solid positive game script, one they haven't been in for quite a few weeks now. And obviously as well, positive matchup for running backs. Indianapolis, 27th in fantasy points allowed to backs and 15th in rush DVOA. So a good matchup there. Not a great matchup though for Austin Eckler, but that doesn't matter. This guy's an absolute animal regardless of the matchup that he has. He loves fantasy football, and he's proven that being the RB1 on the season. The Rams, 12th in fantasy points allowed to running backs and 1st in run defense grade, so a good run defense, even without Aaron Donald, but that doesn't seem to matter for Austin Eckler. He just gets it done. And this team has been running the ball a lot when they're getting to the red zone and inside the 10, so that's been really beneficial for Eckler on a week-to-week basis. 4, Dalvin Cook against the Packers, who are dead last in rush DVOA this season. They're a team that you want to target with running backs. I know it didn't work out last week with either of the Dolphins backs. Well, I guess Jeff Wilson found the end zone, but the split there was tough. Not expecting Raheem Mostert's role to just completely step back again after he looked really good in Wilson's absence and with Wilson dealing with an injury. So that was interesting to see, but is what it is. A good matchup here for Cook. Green Bay also 25th in fantasy points allowed to running backs as well. At 5, Travis Etienne. Now, back-to-back here, Etienne and Henry. Something to keep note of and pay attention to this week is what do these two teams do in terms of keeping guys out, who's going to play, who's not going to play, because their games mean nothing. Like if I'm an NFL head coach, I probably don't play any of these guys. I probably sit most of my roster, especially if you're the Titans, and get healthy, and get as healthy as I can, because these games mean nothing. Everything comes down to next week. Hopefully these guys are playing, because Etienne has a fantastic matchup against the Houston Texans, who are 32nd in fantasy points allowed and 31st in run defense grade. So a really plus matchup for Etienne. I hope he's playing because he's on one of my teams for which I made the championship game for. So really hoping he's available. And then at 6, like I mentioned, Derrick Henry. Dallas is definitely a tougher matchup, 5th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they're 22nd in run defense grade and are giving up over 100 rushing yards per game to running backs. And we know this offense with Malik Willis at QB is just going to live through Derrick Henry, so still no concern for me in this matchup. Here's one of the players I'm very high on this week, Brian Robinson. I think Brian Robinson stinks. I don't think Brian Robinson's a talented running back, but that doesn't seem to matter. Right now, the last 6 weeks, he's averaging, I believe he's averaging about 19.8 touches per game. Yeah, 19.8 touches per game. So he's been given the ball a ton. Cleveland, a fantastic matchup for their ground game as well. 30th in fantasy points allowed, 30th in rush DVOA. If you have Brian Robinson, he's an absolute must start. Last week, I was benching him. This week, I'm playing him. Anytime we're in a plus matchup for Brian Robinson, his volume is there. Now we're just looking for the efficiency, and Cleveland's going to give him that. So love the matchup for Robinson. At 8, James Conner against the Atlanta Falcons, who are 22nd in fantasy points allowed, 23rd in rush DVOA. We're going to see James Conner see a significant workload over these next 2 weeks. Whether Colt McCoy is back, whether it's Trace McSorley, this is a good matchup for them where they could be in a positive game script where they could win. We saw it last week against the Bucs where they were leading, but Connor is just an excellent play right now. He's getting plenty of volume as both a receiver and a runner, so I love Connor this week. 9, Josh Jacobs, San Francisco, tough matchup. Jacobs has been a catalyst for your team and probably a good reason why you'd be playing for a fantasy championship. Jacobs has been great this year, but San Francisco, first in fantasy points allowed to running backs, first in rush DVOA. This is a really tough matchup. We've seen, what was it, a couple weeks ago? Who was it that they lost to? I'm blanking right now, that they blew the game late to. Regardless, this team's running the ball just over and over and over, regardless of a tough matchup. I don't expect that to change with Jacobs, who's been great this season. So I think he can still tread water here and give you a decent fantasy performance, regardless of the bad matchup. 10, Kenneth Walker. I struggled to kind of fill out this area of my rankings, but I go and I look back at Ken Walker the last few weeks, and they are just force-feeding this guy the ball, getting him the ball a ton, regardless of poor game script. The Chiefs were leading the entire game last week, and Walker still had almost 30 touches. It was crazy. So I expect that to continue here. The Jets are a very good pass defense, still good against the run, 6th in fantasy points allowed per game, and 8th in rush DVOA. But again, I do expect the Seattle here to lean on the ground game in this matchup against the Jets, just with the pass defense probably being a little bit better than the run defense. And then as well, they just don't trust their pass game right now with Geno. He hasn't looked good lately. 11, Joe Mixon against the Buffalo Bills. The Bills aren't a great matchup, 10th in fantasy points allowed, but 27th in run defense grade. Mixon coming off a really solid week in the receiving game. We saw Samaje Perine take a bit more of a backseat this past week as well, which is a good sign for Mixon. This should be a really exciting game. The potential for a high scoring game as well. So I do think Mixon is a good play this week too. 12, Nick Chubb. Man, Kevin Stefanski is just not utilizing Nick Chubb in the way I expected him to be using him. With Deshaun Watson's return, he's wanted to see what he's got in Deshaun Watson in these last few weeks of the season. It hasn't been great. Last week was a really tough game for them offensively with the poor weather as well. We talked about that at length on the Twitch on Saturday morning. But we've got Washington. Another tough run defense, 8th in fantasy points allowed, 11th in rush DVOA. So that makes this a tougher play for Chubb. But again, we've seen the pass game struggle. I could see this team lean back on Chubb here after the last couple of weeks. They've got a lot of criticism for the lack of use for one of their best players on the offense. 13, Cam Akers. Massive week. You could be here watching this video because of Cam Akers last week. Another plus matchup for him here against the Chargers. I mentioned that I thought Akers was a good play last week. Turned out he was much, much better than I expected. But the Chargers, 28th in fantasy points allowed, 29th in run defense grade. This is a very good matchup for Akers. The Chargers offense, the defense has been playing incredible, but the offense has not been good lately, and that gives me a little bit of a reason to expect that Akers could see a decent game script, at least early on, that his volume is there. And this team's, of course, going to lean on the run. Their pass protection is terrible. Their weapons offensively in the pass game are not good either, so I do like Akers. 14, Tyler Algier, one of my favorite plays this week. Algier has seen significant volume. He succeeded Cordero Patterson on the depth chart. He almost doubled him in snaps last week. We're seeing him involved as a receiver as well. Algier in a very good matchup against Arizona. Another one, much like I mentioned with Connor, there's an opportunity here for a competitive game script. Potential for Atlanta to be leading this game too. Arizona's 26th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 27th in rush DVOA. And this Atlanta offense, especially with Desmond Ridder at QB, is going to lean on the ground game here in a matchup where they see that they can have some success. We saw them do it anyways against the Ravens in a matchup that I thought they'd really struggle to run the ball. They were still pretty good with Algier, so I really like Algier this week in this matchup. 15, Tony Pollard. Pollard missed practice yesterday, so something to monitor throughout the week, but I still have him here in my rankings. I do expect him to play. Tennessee, a tough matchup for their ground game. 3rd in fantasy points allowed, 2nd in rush DVOA. So I think this is a very, very tough matchup for their ground game, but also they're 10.5-point favorites on Thursday night. And, the Titans have no offense to speak of right now. So Pollard could be in a positive game script and give him that volume to really elevate his floor. I'm just a little bit worried about the upside. It's going to be a low-scoring game as well, and one that Pollard will need to get good volume to be able to give you this RB2 type week. But I think he can give you that. 16, Alvin Kamara. I'm tired of expecting Alvin Kamara to find the end zone or be efficient. he was solid last week. Like, he got it done for you, but it took way too long for me. Like, we played his prop, that hit, which was great. But I'm looking at, a spot here against Philly, 15th in fantasy points allowed, 19th in rush DVOA. It puts us in a spot here where my expectation as to what to expect from this team in terms of how efficient they can be offensively and what they can do to stay in this game against Philly. It's just so up in the air. I just don't get what they're doing offensively right now. It's just so bad. But I do think Kamara, the Eagles, Jordan Davis' status up in the air, they could run the ball effectively here, potentially. So I still think Kamara with his volume and opportunity is still a decent play. 17, Jerick McKinnon, Denver. We saw them get absolutely torched by the Rams last week. This team is in disarray now with the firing of Nathaniel Hackett. McKinnon, always seen that solid volume as a receiver as well, getting a little bit of work in the ground game. It's time for me to respect him and just have him ranked ahead of Isaiah Pacheco. In PPR formats, his receiving opportunity definitely elevates him. And this is a matchup for Kansas City where I expect the ground and the backs to be a little bit more efficient than the pass game. This is still a very good Denver secondary. 18, Roger Stevenson. You're wondering where he is, usually a top 10 guy. Last week was putrid. I could see this team getting Damian Harris more involved, getting Pierre Strong more involved. Stevenson's, turned that horrible late game blunder. I know it was more Jacoby Myers, but still the decision to pitch it off was still started with Stevenson. And then last week was not good for him. So I'm a little bit worried in this matchup against Miami. Yes, 16th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they're 5th in run defense grade. I think they're a good run defense. Stevenson and this, obviously, as well, the Patriots offense has been terrible. They didn't get across midfield, I think, until the third quarter last week. Stevenson's got to be able to score to be really good and be a top 12 back. It's not like I have him ranked outside my top 24. RB18, I think, is a solid spot for him where you're still going to play him. 19, J.K. Dobbins, Steelers, Sunday Night Football. The Ravens' status in terms of their offense with or without Lamar Jackson is up in the air. I don't know if Jackson's going to play or not. And if he does, I still think Dobbins is a good play. If he doesn't, I know Dobbins is going to see plenty of volume. Obviously split with Gus Edwards, but he's still their number one guy between the two. Steelers are a pretty good run defense, 7th in run defense grade, 13th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. But I mean, the Ravens have no pass game. Like they can't move the ball through the air. So I expect them to lean on the ground, continue to lean on the ground. So I still think Dobbins is a good play because he should see volume. And I don't think, the Steelers are like a world stopper run defense. 20, Jamal Williams. So I'm going between Swift and between Jamal Williams. And I'm like, I don't love these guys. They haven't been efficient whatsoever. What do I expect in terms of the split? It's not like, Justin Jackson's still involved. But then I'm like, well, we're playing the Bears, and the Bears just give up a ton of points. Their defense has been terrible the last 8 weeks or so, 10 weeks now. It's been a fair bit of a sample size. And we saw this game have a ton of points last time they played. Williams is the red zone guy. Williams is the goal line guy. So I've got to have him in my top 24 because he's probably going to score. I mean, there's a good chance, very good chance he's going to score. I would play him in this matchup against the Bears. 29th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 30th in run defense grade. Jamal Williams, in my mind, is a solid play this week. 21, Aaron Jones. Jones against the Vikings. He's coming off a bad week last week against Miami. This is another good run defense, 19th in fantasy points allowed, but 2nd in run defense grade. I like Minnesota's run defense. This is going to be all about, can Jones get a little bit more involved in the pass game? And I think that's a problem for him to do so with the Packers getting healthy at the receiver spot. Randall Cobb, Romeo Doubs, Alan Lazard, Christian Watson. There's a ton of options for Rodgers. Jones is still the number one. I know Dillon touched him last week and had more rushing attempts. Neither one was very good in their rushing work against Miami, which isn't that surprising. I still think Jones has the upper hand, so I have him now as like a low-end RB2 on the week. Pacheco at 22 against Denver. I mentioned this is a positive for their ground game. Denver really sliding backwards in terms of their defense. 18th in fantasy points allowed to running backs and 22nd in rush DVOA. So what kind of Denver team are we going to get after the firing of Hackett, all the shit that went on post-game and during the game? Could this team just be rolling over and Kansas City takes care of business early and leans on Pacheco and McKinnon to kind of run things out? That could definitely happen. 23, Zach Moss. I mean, the fucking idiots in the comments section telling me Deion Jackson was the guy to pick up last week. I mean, where was your headspace at in that decision? We look at last week, or we look at Monday night, Deion Jackson nowhere to be found because he basically cost them the game last week or the week prior. Zach Moss getting all the work, another plus matchup here. Didn't do too much in his matchup against Los Angeles, which was disappointing. But I mean, if Nick Foles maybe took care of the ball just the tiniest of little bits, Moss could have had a really good solid week because this team was kind of in the game all evening. But then the turnovers really killed them in scoring opportunities and just the ability to stay in it right to the end. And that took Moss away from being leaned on in the run game. But the Giants, a team that don't tend to run away with games, and they're pretty bad against the run as well. 31st in rush DVOA. It's second last in the NFL, and 24th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. I think Moss is an excellent flex option this week. I don't expect the Colts to want to throw the ball too much because their quarterbacks have not done a good job for them. And a lot of that comes down to protection too, but I think Moss is an excellent play as my RB23. RB24 is Ezekiel Elliott. I mentioned that Titans defense and how good it is. I still think 10.5 point favorites could lean on the ground game. We know Zeke and his involvement, regardless of how much better or worse he looks than Tony Pollard, he's still going to have a pretty even workload, or just a little bit less than Pollard. So still like Zeke and what could be a very positive game script for this team as well. All right, our final 6 here to get to our top 30. 25, DeAndre Swift. Swift outsnapped Jamal Williams. Did not out-touch him on the ground, but outsnapped him. I still think Williams has the edge. If we're looking at how valuable this matchup is, it's on those scoring opportunities and giving up points, which Chicago has been doing a ton of lately. So I still think Swift is a decent play because I think he's the more explosive back. I think he's the more explosive player, but Williams is the guy in the red zone. So that gives me more of that like RB3, flex consideration type player with Swift. My RB26, Michael Carter. Michael Carter outsnapped Zonovan Knight last week, and Knight has been really bad the last 2 to 3 weeks. Really, really bad efficiency-wise. I could see Carter, I'm projecting Carter to take over here in a matchup against Seattle, and it's a very good one, right? I'm not saying Carter is going to have this backfield to himself, but the Jets here have a good matchup to run on. 31st in fantasy points allowed are the Seahawks and 25th in rushing DVOA. So a very good matchup for their ground game. I think Carter is that guy, a lot of you might skip over. I think this week he does garner consideration. Definitely throw some wide receivers at me that you might be considering. And I'm happy to help you kind of make that start-sit decision this week. 27, Leonard Fournette against Carolina. The Panthers, 22nd in fantasy points allowed, 18th in rush DVOA. Tampa Bay at home hosting Carolina. Short favorites here. I mean, Fournette had a significant advantage in carries. I think he had 20 last week. So he does have more opportunities than White. I mean, how high can I be on him, though, against Carolina? It's definitely a decent matchup for their ground game, but their efficiency is atrocious. So problem is these guys are not very reliable. The offense is not scoring points right now. So that's why I'm very much tempered on my expectation from Fournette right now and for the rest of the season, I guess, for this final week of the season. RB28, David Montgomery, Detroit. So we got Khalil Herbert back. Herbert was kind of infused into the offense right away. There wasn't any look to me of like, okay, let's ease him in, coming back from injury. He was right in there, but we still saw Montgomery have the advantage with opportunities by a decent margin. So I think Montgomery in a matchup against Detroit is a good opportunity here for this team to score. They were finding ways to do so in the previous matchup, and with Fields, this offense has looked really good. So I expect scoring opportunities. I expect Montgomery to see those opportunities in the red zone. So I like them in this matchup. The Lions, what do we have here? We've got them 31st We've got them as outside the top 25 in rush DVOA, and I believe they're like 24th in fantasy points allowed to running back. So a good matchup for Montgomery. Yeah, 21st in fantasy points allowed to running backs. 29, Deonta Foreman. I struggle with this one because obviously Foreman's coming off the big week. It was really tough to place him here. But Tampa Bay is a good run defense, 7th in fantasy points allowed, 13th in rush DVOA. Look, every game Tampa Bay is playing in lately just does not produce a lot of points. They're a good run defense. And so I do expect Carolina to struggle to score. And I'm not sure Foreman can maintain that efficiency from last week. I still think he's a good play because Carolina does lean on the ground game quite a bit. And I don't think Tampa Bay is like a high level run defense. They're solid. They're a good run defense. I think it'll be tough for him to score, but I still think his opportunities are there, which can elevate his floor this week. Wrapping things up for the top 30, Miles Sanders. Sanders is really frustrating because he's fumbled the last couple of weeks. He saw some volume last week, but wasn't efficient in it. And I'm very worried because I saw Ken Gainwell get involved a little bit more. I saw him inside the red zone getting involved. I'm a little bit worried about Sanders in this matchup against New Orleans, which is a pretty average run defense, average team against running backs. But I'm just a little bit worried about this split and potentially leaning more on the pass game. They've looked really good through the air with both Minshew and Hurts. So, tempered expectations for Sanders this week. He's definitely an RB3 for me. Guys that are out that you guys are probably wondering about. Najee Harris. Baltimore is just a team I'm avoiding going against with running backs. I know Algier was good last week, but Baltimore's a really, really good run defense, and I think the Steelers will need to lean more on Kenny Pickett in this matchup, and I already can tell you that Harris is just not a very efficient back, and this offensive line isn't creating a lot of space for him, so I struggle to want to start Harris this week. I know he's given us a few good weeks lately, but this week I would definitely look to sit him. Same goes for the Miami running backs. We saw Jeff Wilson back. New England's second in fantasy points allowed to running backs. I think it's a tough matchup with these two guys splitting opportunities too. Now, there is the chance, with Tua likely to be out, that they elevate and give more work to their backs. But, I mean, you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You want to get the ball to those guys as opposed to Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert. A.J. Dillon, RB31, just out. Devin Singletary, RB32, just out. I don't think those guys are terrible plays, but I mentioned kind of the matchup for Green Bay running against Minnesota. And then Buffalo splitting work between Singletary and Cook, and then Cincinnati's a very good run defense. So that is my top 30 running backs on the week. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. We really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us. All fantasy season, we'll have our wide receiver start sit video out as well this week. And of course, like I mentioned, the content, NFL content, does not end here. We'll be with you for the entirety of the playoffs. We'll be dropping videos next week, so make sure you're tuning in. But thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.